Oh boy, it's time for another delightful, pleasant rant. So, what's the subject? God! This is a big one. Many people who have followed me throughout the years are aware that I do not care for the arguments, behaviors, and mentalities presented by Nintendo fanboys, and I have mocked them on numerous occasions as a result. However, I can't act too high and mighty because I used to be one of these fanboys. Many of these arguments and mentalities of subject I have utilized before but have since then abandoned. Can't imagine why. So before I move on, I feel I need to address a few things. I am targeting the mentalities, behaviors, and actions themselves, not the people who utilize them. I'm also going to try to stick to the arguments at hand as opposed to targeting individual people, as I feel that would be immature and would otherwise distract from what I'm overall trying to accomplish with this video. If you are a big Nintendo fan, I'm not criticizing you because of your interests. That would be stupid. Everyone has the right to like whatever it is that they like. Even if you utilize the mentalities I'm expressing anger towards, I'm not angry at you as a person. I probably don't know you. I'm angry at the mentalities. With that said, let's move forward. As for what I think of Nintendo in general, I think they're a pretty decent company. They're good at making intuitive and overall entertaining games. However, their games don't exactly have that much depth to them, or otherwise don't have that much substance most of the time. I'm left under the impression that they focus more so on the gameplay mechanics as opposed to the game design, and I feel that last one is more important when making a strong game. As a result, many of the games of subject feel pretty empty, especially in comparison to the works of some other development studios. Does that make their games bad? No, not at all. But I feel that some of these games are really over-glorified, and there are definitely better games out there when you take the time to look. Seeing how obsessed they are with over-glorifying these games, one of the smaller issues I have with them is that they fail to understand that if we've heard it the first million times and nothing new is being brought to the table, we really don't need to hear it again. We all know Ocarina of Time is supposedly the best game ever. We all know how awesome Starfox 64 is, and so on. The problem with this is that it gets old really fast, especially when it's bludgeoned into your skull like this. I swear, if I hear one more goddamn do a barrel roll reference, half of my brain cells will die on the spot. It's not funny, it's just annoying. I realize that some of the topics of my videos tend to overlap and can be a little bit repetitive as well, but I try to only bring up games when I can bring something new to the table. Or heck, maybe I disagree with the majority opinion entirely in some cases. And it's not like there isn't other stuff out there worth talking about aside from the Nintendo games. One of the key things that irritates me about Nintendo fanboys right off the bat is how closed-minded they are. They talk about how these games are the best games ever, and by default have no competition. I think this is a stupid argument in application to any game, but let's push that aside and keep moving. One of the problems with this application of the argument in particular is that Nintendo fanboys often stick to their comfort zones and dismiss other games as rip-offs, not as important to gaming as a whole, and so on. I'll dive into how stupid some of these supporting arguments are in a bit. However, those things, even if they were true, aren't real indicators of quality. So especially when gaming is so vast and diverse, if all you do is stick to your confined comfort zone, how do you really know? It also doesn't help that I've heard people argue that some games, just for being in the same genre as Nintendo games, shouldn't be made and otherwise don't deserve to exist, like Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures. Pac-Man shouldn't be in a platform game, even though he's one of the pioneers of said genre and has been doing this for the past 30 years! Only Mario should exist. He's more innovative. Only through the plumber god will we find salvation. The fanboys make a really big deal of how significant Nintendo is to gaming and how innovative their games are, and that's used to justify everything they say and do. The problem with that, aside from encouraging rampant irrationality as well as innovation not really mattering when it comes to the quality of the game, is that Nintendo isn't anywhere near as innovative as people claim. They don't innovate as much as they popularize. Super Mario Bros., for example, is often praised to no end for inventing the side-scrolling platformer genre. In reality, it didn't at all. I say this so damn often, but it bears repeating. Pac-Land is arguably the first side-scrolling platformer. To add to this, Pac-Land's platforming was more so environment-based than Mario's, and as a result, Pac-Man was doing things that Mario wouldn't do until the sequels. And to add to this, the ground wasn't entirely flat. There would be imperfections in the path, and Pac-Man's altitude on the screen would vary to match such an occurrence. It also utilized multiple layers of parallax scrolling, something that wasn't done until much later, and was even left out of the home console ports for quite a while. So it's definitely arguable that this game is a lot more innovative than Super Mario Bros. It's funny because it has been stated that this is what inspired Shigeru Miyamoto to create Super Mario Bros. In the first place. This is especially funny because the Pac-Man series gets a lot of flack from Nintendo fanboys for being a rip-off of Mario. But by their logic, Mario already ripped off Pac-Man right from the beginning. So why is one of the pioneers of the platformer genre supposedly forbidden from continuing to make games of that type? It's because people are idiots. Starfox for the Super Nintendo is widely considered to be revolutionary for its use of polygonal models, when in reality this sort of thing has been done long before. The 1983 arcade game I, Robot was the first game to use polygonal models, and was a mix between a platformer, a puzzle game, and a spaceship shooter, all of which were done in a 3D environment. It's not like this sort of thing was never used again up until Starfox either. You saw polygonal models used all of the time in home computer games like Sylpheed, and a lot of racing games. This is especially hilarious because Sylpheed, Sega CD's successor, is often cited as a Starfox ripoff, when, as previously implied, Sylpheed did it beforehand. Zelda's gameplay is far from original either. You had games like High Glide and the Druid series on the home computers of the time preceding it as well. Even with that aside, The Legend of Zelda is often noted for inventing save systems using battery backup data storage. Well, again, that's not entirely true. High Glide also had quick save and load options in addition to passwords, though evidently they were of a different type and did not use the battery backup system. However, there was a lot of programming unrelated to gaming in the 80s, before then, and even to this day. Some of the primary functions of programming are to compute and store data. With that said, isn't it likely that such a method of storing data was initially utilized outside of gaming, where there's more of a focus on computing and storing data on its own? Is this example based on anything that concrete? Not entirely, but that presents one of the key problems with the whole innovation argument. It's hardly ever concrete to begin with. There is always the possibility that another game tucked somewhere in the darkest depths of gaming did exactly what you're praising as innovative before the game you're praising supposedly invented whatever it is that you're talking about. That's why I try to stay away from the innovation argument in application to anything. In addition, real innovation doesn't just pop out of nowhere. It's more gradual than that, as all ideas come from somewhere. It stuns me that Nintendo fanboys accuse so many games for being rip-offs of Nintendo games, not just because their claims of Nintendo being the powerhouse of innovation have no ground to stand on, as the things the fanboys praise Nintendo for supposedly inventing were never their ideas to begin with, but a rip-off implies that there's no originality present. A lot of the games that are labeled as rip-offs by this large faction of the gaming community actually do have their own elements that really make them stand out, and it becomes abundantly clear that this conclusion is formed out of pure impulse, instead of a well-thought-out analysis of the subject. Heck, I'd argue that some of these supposed rip-offs are actually better than the Nintendo games that they're being compared to. Again, proving that having similarities to another game doesn't inherently make it worse. Plus, it's not like Nintendo has never made games that fit into this stupid, not well-thought-out at all application of the term rip-off. For example, Shigeru Miyamoto created Devil World for the Famicom in 1984. If you ever wanted more crucifixes in a Pac-Man maze game, then this is for you. So even by their standards, Nintendo falls victim of the same thing. But it's okay here, because it's by Nintendo. We're not blindly trying to cover our biases at all. It's funny because with the Turrican fanbase, members actively look for games that are similar to that series and alert other fans not to criticize the game of subject, but primarily to have fun with a moderately similar experience. Heck, they advertise and promote direct clones when they're in development for similar reasons. Sites like Turk and SATA, SATA standing for Search for Turk and Alternatives, are examples of this. This is a much healthier approach. It's almost like Nintendo fanboys see similar games to their favorites as a threat somehow. To make matters worse, these fanboys, the people who are the most vocal about innovations in gaming, very clearly don't value actual innovation. I mean, I don't hold innovation in too high a regard, but at least I'm honest about it. The games that are more original, the games that actually did innovative and interesting things on this level, are often pushed to the side, are forgotten about, and left in the dust in favor of the Nintendo games. There are games like Elite on the early home computers, which was a 3D open world, scratch that, open universe space exploration game from 1983. Does that matter? No, of course not. All that matters is that Mario inventing side-scrolling platformers even though he didn't, thus bringing back gaming even though he didn't. All hail the plumber god. When you actually pull your head out of your anal cavity, it becomes very apparent that what little legitimate innovation and originality in the gaming industry that there is isn't so consistent in its distribution. In reality, it's scattered all over the place. Sometimes you'll find it in arcade games, sometimes you'll find it in some home computer games, and yes, sometimes you'll find it on home consoles. But often, you'll find it in more diverse realms of gaming. However, if that diversity isn't good enough indication, then I'll just say it right now, it's not all from one company! So Nintendo clearly doesn't deserve being put on this kind of pedestal. Heck, I can't think of a single development studio that actually does! I see the innovation triumphs overall mentality as especially problematic, seeing how people are finally starting to question how a game can be art. As an independent game designer and someone who likes to look at gaming on a more artistic level, one of my major problems with the innovation argument in general is that it brings attention more so towards the concepts being utilized, the more surfacey elements, and takes that attention away from the actual application of said concepts, which is what really matters in the end, especially when determining whether or not the game has artistic merit. And especially when people generalize innovation in gaming to just what supposedly invented what genre. Did 2001: A Space Odyssey invent the science fiction genre? No, it just utilized what it had in an artistic manner, culminating in an artistic result. Did Turrican 2: The Final Fight and Pac-Man World 2 invent the platformer genre? No, they just utilized what they had in an artistic manner, culminating in an artistic result. Did Star Wars Rogue Squadron invent flying games? No, it just utilized what it had in an artistic manner, culminating in an artistic result. See the pattern? As far as a game's artistic merit goes, innovation doesn't mean shit! Especially when it's generalized to such a disgustingly specific degree. With those factors in mind, yes, it's good to see originality in games, but that can shine through in different ways. For example, a game utilizing similar concepts to another game can become its own thing when those concepts are utilized in a different way. And this is more common than you would think. Nintendo fanboys persistently fail to understand that when evaluating a game, you can't just look solely at the gameplay mechanics and other surfacey elements. You have to look at the core, how the game is designed, how the elements on the surface are actually implemented through said design, and so on. Looking closely at this game's design choices, the game is trying to achieve this result. Let me evaluate the game even further to see how successful it is in that endeavor, and if the other game design choices support each other in achieving the game's overall objective. To make things even worse, people look at Nintendo's gameplay mechanics as the only way to do things. If a game of the same type deviates from Nintendo's standard, then it's inherently bad in the eyes of the gaming community. We value originality, hence why we hold every game to the expectation to play out exactly like what Nintendo has done. This right here doesn't exclusively apply to Nintendo fanboys anymore. This is directed at the gaming community as a whole. This is the light in which games have been and are still evaluated in. This has been done persistently by pretty much everyone imaginable. Professional reviewers, the comedic online reviewers, the somewhat journalistic reviewers, let's players, idiots in comment sections, forums. This mentality is everywhere and it needs to stop. But at the same time, there's another expectation that's not only equally widespread and shared by the same people, but completely contradicts the prior expectation. If a game resembles a Nintendo game in any shape or form, no matter how superficial the application, it is always a ripoff. So a game can't be different from a Nintendo game, but it can't be similar either. Doesn't that make so much sense? Doesn't that leave game developers in such a good spot? This right here is exactly why so many games end up being underrated and overlooked. But is that what matters when talking about games not being judged fairly? No, of course not. All that matters is that Luigi's Mansion got a 7 out of 10 instead of a perfect 10 out of 10. Those bastards! Yeah, despite being pretty much the dominant voice of the gaming community, Nintendo fanboys tend to have this huge persecution complex. Whenever a Nintendo game gets anything but sycophantic praise, they become sad, angry, lost, and confused. In response, they will use whatever blanket statement they can find and make rampant application of it. This is exactly why you hear them say, "You're biased," so damn often. Because as we all know, Nintendo fanboys are the epitome of rational and objective thought, and aren't biased in the slightest. In all sincerity, it amazes me that the people who criticize others for being biased the most in the gaming community are debatably the most biased people in that bunch. In addition, they are unbelievably insecure. If you dare question any of their conclusions on Ocarina of Time, Starfox 64, and so on, you almost never get anything even resembling a well-supported answer. You'll just get death threats and continuous harassment. They like to pretend that should be self-explanatory. If any reasoning is provided, it'll always be along the lines of, "This game sold this amount of copies and is popular," like that matters. Or, "It was innovative, it invented this," and I already spent a good amount of time in this video talking about just how stupid that is, so I won't go into more detail. Then you have my personal favorite. "You had to be around when it was new." Like I said in my gaming generation elitism rant, though in a different context, a game's overall quality isn't based on playing it at a precise time. If a game is truly great, it will hold the test of time no matter how old it is. As much as I talk about the Turrican games, I did not grow up with them at all. This series ran from 1989 to 1995, and was popular in Europe, but practically unheard of in the United States. I am an American, and I was born in 1994, and yet I consider Turrican 2 in particular to be one of the best games I've ever played. So clearly, if a game from 1991 can hold up so well after all these years, even in the eyes of someone who did not grow up with it, a game from 1998 on a more well-known system should be able to do the same. It becomes very apparent that they're just throwing whatever superficial argument out there, hoping in vain that will suffice. When you hear people talk about how deep Nintendo games are, it all seems to be focused on story and characters. These elements really don't define gameplay, and it's not hard to see that those areas are ones in which Nintendo usually does pretty poorly. Though even putting those things aside, what they're talking about never seems to be based on anything concrete, and comes across as speculation at best and just making up shit at worst. Now, if Nintendo's games, in this realm and others, really did have more depth to them, they wouldn't need to do this. And perhaps this whole situation demonstrates that, regardless of the usual fun factor, Nintendo's games are pretty bare bones most of the time. It's hard to find complexity in something that does not possess a lot of complexity. Some of you may be thinking that, oh, these are kids' games, they don't need to have thought-provoking moments or interesting game design. However, if we want gaming to progress as an art form, developers making games targeted towards children should at least try to catch up with children's movies. Let's look at a scene from, say, Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The God Help the Outcast scene criticizes the hypocrisy within religion. It establishes that religion itself can be a comforting thing, and overall a source of hope. However, it becomes dangerous when one takes it too far, turning that source of hope into a source of self-entitlement and overall indulgence. Seeing how the female lead Esmeralda establishes at the beginning of the song that she's not very religious, heck, she may or may not believe in a god to begin with, and she's very selfless and accepting, while the more religious people are selfish and bigoted, the scene asks the question, how can a religion based on love and acceptance be a source of hate and selfishness?
I thought we all were the children of God.
It's for kids is not an excuse. With that said, How can we teach messages and overall provide more emotionally challenging moments in gaming? Well, many people would agree that experience is the best teacher, and one of the wonderful things about gaming that nobody seems to understand is that we can create those experiences. We can teach the player stuff about the world, we can make them question things, and we can allow them to see the world in a whole new way. In all of my years of gaming, I've only played one game that actually understood this, and for some bullshit reason I'm not supposed to admire it for that. The scary thing is that Nintendo not only just sticks to making fun little time wasters not acknowledging this, but in fact they refuse to acknowledge this. Recently, Nintendo has been announcing a game called Tomodachi Life. It was also announced that there's to be a marriage mechanic, but only for straight people. People understandably got upset, and Nintendo responded by stating that Nintendo never intended to make any form of social commentary with the launch of Tomodachi Life. I will say right now that they are failing miserably in such an endeavor, seeing how if you include a marriage mechanic in a game like this, you are going to make a statement regardless, and the statement that's left is a largely negative one. I appreciate the apology, but that's not exactly going to remedy this. Putting all of that aside, this only makes me happier that I'm an indie developer. I can say whatever the hell I want without having to worry, but if gaming is truly art, shouldn't we do our best to utilize the medium to communicate shit like this? Of course, it's Nintendo. If they don't want to do anything of substance, that's fine. So if that's the case, then why do Nintendo fanboys persistently display an inability to let go and acknowledge that there's very likely stronger material out there, especially if gaming continues to progress as an art form? I feel that some of it definitely comes from a lack of exposure, but that's almost entirely self-imposed. I think that a lot of it really does come from that very attachment, often nostalgia to be more precise. What they don't realize is that you can still maintain that subjective bond while still acknowledging issues present. Shrek Extra Large, for example, is a game I'm very nostalgic towards, but I know doesn't work. Does that stop me from enjoying it as much? No, I still really like the game. I just acknowledge it has problems. That may be a very interesting subject to review, but I digress. Heck, one of my most nostalgic games is Super Mario World. It's definitely a very good game, but again, it doesn't have as much substance as some other games I've played, so I don't talk about it as much. But that doesn't stop me from loving the game, even if my cartridge does have a sick obsession with erasing its own save data. Maybe this is why they're so closed-minded, why they don't want to try things outside of their comfort zone. Maybe they just want that bond to continue and grow. This may explain why the new Super Mario Bros. Games and Super Mario Galaxy 2 are praised as much as they are. It's like playing that childhood game again. But again, what all this demonstrates is how much Nintendo fanboys indulge themselves in their biases and comfort zone, which aren't exactly the most positive things to do, especially when it results in the irrational, closed-minded, and mean-spirited nature of most Nintendo fanboys. Again, they will do anything, and I mean anything, to make sure they don't have to let go. I will conclude with one of the big ones, one of the dumbest and most rage-inducing things that this large faction of the gaming community does, but hardly anyone calls them out for. Their lies about video game history, that practically everyone in the gaming community not only believes, but actively spreads. Nintendo fanboys often talk about how all other video game companies owe everything to Nintendo for not only being innovative, but for bringing back gaming after the video game crash. Here's the thing, gaming never died to begin with. To start, the crash only affected North America. The Europeans were enjoying home computer gaming, and Japan was being Japan, moving forward with arcade games and home consoles. In addition, the crash was merely a shift of interest. Attention drifted away from the home consoles like the Atari 2600 and moved to the home computers like the Commodore 64, very much like the Europeans. Who knows, if attention stayed with the home computers, maybe games like Turrican would be more well known over here, but evidently that didn't happen. What Nintendo did was bring back the attention to home consoles, but not worldwide, as the Europeans largely stuck to the home computers of the time and really started to push what could be done with them. In addition, as I previously mentioned, Nintendo didn't invent any genres, and they didn't bring back gaming from the grave because it was never laid to rest to begin with. Their role in gaming history and culture has been over-glorified in every sense. It's to the point where Nintendo's reputation doesn't accurately represent the company and their games in the slightest, and that's what disturbs me the most. When you hear people talk about why these games are respected as much as they are, it's always based on, it innovated gaming, or it was the first to do this, when in reality, that's bullshit. It was always bullshit. These mentalities need to rot and die. These arguments need to rot and die. All of this needs to rot and die. Nobody should care this much about who is the first person to use this concept or that concept, especially when it's this undeserved. What you should care about is who did it better. What game made better application of concept A or B? Because then we get closer to truly understanding game design as an art form. It alarms me that such an understanding is as far behind as it is, when such a subject is brought up that much, and none of this is helping one bit. It needs to stop. The cure for Nintendo fanboyism is exposure. Exposure to other things. So go out there and see what you can find. You will be a lot more mentally sound.